Nice to have you here. You just walked up from a great conversation with Tim O'Reilly where you talked about a host of issues related to digital democracy, to electronic voting, and to the really state of well, affairs in California, which is not surprising as you're the Secretary of State there. One of the things that really raised a lot of interest, I think, in the community, both here and those watching online, was an endorsement of open source in voting. And what is your thinking on that? That's important in the context of the size and prominence of California in the world.
Well, first, I always think that as California goes, so goes the nation. It may take a while, and as the nation goes, we hope that that we are a role model for the world, although it is not always so. But after commissioning a top-to-bottom review of the voting systems that we use in California, and having programmers and security experts from around the country, private and public sector, look at what we had and what we were doing, it became very clear that we have a lot of software that was not coded with security in mind. It just wasn't there, and that a lot of the security is based on a concept called security by obscurity, which means that as long as the code is secret or the key is kept secret, that the system is secure. But as we've seen by the fact that voting machines had turned up in researchers' offices and in various places, it's hard to keep even something like a voting machine. And in California, with 25,000 polling places, think about how many we would use. So it's just better to have a system that's open by its nature. It avoids questions of whether the coders are responsible to the citizenry or to a private profit-based interest. And it allows checking of anyone with programming skills of the work that's been done, which I think provides a level of security that is, I mean, it's why we have some of our security-based federal government agencies using open source software.
So that's a perfect lead into a question that we had from someone in the audience, California resident, Ryan Alfred, who liked the idea of open source voting, but had a straightforward concern. Will the technology increase the percentage of citizens who vote?
Well, it should decrease the percentage of citizens who don't vote because they think that that the vote is manipulated or could likely be manipulated, at least in that one way. Other than that, I think there are just so many pieces to why people vote. It's hard for me to understand in some respects, but I think when I see people who don't vote, it's largely because they think it doesn't matter, and I think it does. In fact, I know it does.
Right. Well, you could see in the outcomes of close elections at the local, state, and national level that the vote actually does have an impact. I think a decade ago we saw the impact of a very close vote in Florida. So to take it in a slightly different direction, and back to the open source issue, does the use of that kind of technology have a role in closing state budget deficit gaps, potentially?
It's a good question. The one thing that it does is because the software is licensed without cost, essentially what you have is a service model. And if you are unhappy with whoever it is that you've chosen to service your voting system, you don't have to throw all of it out the window, go find a different vendor and buy all new hardware and all new software, because most of the software that's written in voting world only runs on hardware that's proprietary to a particular vendor. So if you are unhappy with your voting system vendor right now, what you have to do is start all over and scrap the whole thing rather than saying, well, we want someone else to do the work. So that is probably the biggest potential cost saver.
So you took a lot of heat when you decertified electronic voting machines, and that decision has stuck around in terms of thinking about what the future of that electronic voting process could be. When will it be possible to deploy digital voting in California?
You know, we could create a digital voting system if we were willing to spend enough money to do it. When I look at nuclear submarines and the software that runs them, it has to be zero defect because lives are at risk. And but the cost is phenomenal. I mean, each line of code gets signed off by 3 different people. It takes a very long time, so it's not very flexible. And I always wonder whether there are other things we should be focusing on first. I'd rather see us focus on a voter registration system that has information goes from the Department of Motor Vehicles or wherever. The first time a citizen has contact with the government, then that information goes into the voter registration database. If they're not yet 18, they are then registered automatically at 18. More efficient ways of making sure that the list is good, and then focusing on the part of it that is responsible for turnouts that sometimes are in the range of 33% or lower of registered voters. So all these are questions of how we spend limited resources since we don't have a voting sugar daddy.
Right. The challenge in this particular area, I think, is in understanding this intersection of civics and technology. Right. One of the things that always comes back is, while it's possible to create systems that might be more efficient or might be more standardized, might be more modular, there's always this larger issue of whether the people who are traditionally left out of the process are brought back in, the famous digital divide, which is something I know that you've talked about a lot in the past. Yeah. What does the civic nexus look like here in terms of information literacy? What can California do about that?
Well, it's a huge issue, and I think it actually came to play when it comes to questions like when can we vote online. If ATMs can handle all our banking, why can't we vote in the same manner? And people haven't stopped to think about the fact that the error rate for ATMs is, we're guessing, somewhere between 1% and 3% between the ATM and the banking system. The banks don't have to tell us what the error rate is. All they have to do is make up for the mistakes by putting money back where it should have been. Same is true with online stock trading. A 1% to 3% error rate in elections is not tolerable.
Margin of victory.
It has to be zero. Yeah. So there are, I think, throughout our system, getting citizens acclimated to asking the next question and the next question is important. But with government, knowing who is responsible and how things work, it's something we start in 4th grade in California. But the very concept of democracy has to be taught. There's nothing about self-governance that is that's intuitive or wired. It may be instinctive. I mean, people may instinctively think that I should be in charge of my own affairs. But throughout the history of humankind, it has not been the norm for very long.
That's all quite new to us.
Yeah.
And I keep coming back to Mr. Churchill on that. It's the worst form of government around,
right,
except for all the rest,
right,
to paraphrase.
No, I love that. But I think that many of us take for granted the rights that we have to vote. And one of my favorite county-level projects in Orange County, California, they have a traveling van, and in it there's a series of machines that have the test that was imposed on African American voters, the literacy test that they were required to pass in order to register to vote. And so when young people come in, they are forced to, they take their hand at that and see if they can answer questions like, how many square miles in the District of Columbia? The correct answer to which, from a civic education point of view, is, who cares? What does that have to do with it? But we take a lot of that for granted, and we don't think about the fact that King George would have been telling us what we could and couldn't have on the iPod if it hadn't been for some...
You think he'd be tougher than Steve Jobs? And with that thought, thank you very much.
Thank you.